"What the hell are you doing with my daughter?" Gray Lawrence Langston's voice, the father of the little girl who had just fallen into the pool, ripped through the thick summer air. What he saw was his 6-year-old daughter, Isabel, trembling and soaked to the bone, sitting beside the young maid at the pool's edge. Maria Wilson, the maid, was drenched, gasping for air with a pale face, but ignored. "Sweetheart, are you okay? Are you hurt?" He crouched down, checking Isabel's tiny arms, looking for bruises, cuts, signs of injury. Have you ever wondered why the moments that split a life in two come quiet first, like the silence before a storm, and then roar loud enough to shake a man's bones? Before we continue following the dramatic developments ahead, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to give me motivation to keep bringing you more captivating stories. And where are you listening to this story from? Leave a comment and let me know. Now, let's return to the story. That was how everything started for Gray Lawrence Langston. He was a man of order, sharp suits, fast cars, and a vineyard that stretched out like a kingdom. He believed in balance sheets and schedules, in the comforting hum of machines, and the silence of locked doors. But that summer evening, none of it mattered. He came home fast, the tires of his black sedan hissing on the long driveway. And before the engine even cooled, he was running. Briefcase dropped, tie loosened, breath ragged. The sun was still high, spilling over the tiled patio, and the pool water shimmered bright enough to hurt the eyes. And there, at the edge of it, sat his little girl, Isabel, 6 years old, hair plastered to her cheeks, skin pale and trembling. And beside her, Maria Wilson, the maid, wet through, lips blue, chest heaving like a runner at the end of a race. "Sweetheart," Gray Lawrence said, dropping to his knees, hands scanning Isabel's arms, her knees every inch for bruises. "Are you hurt? Tell me," she coughed, small and shivering. I'm okay, Daddy. I fell. Miss Maria." She jumped in. But he didn't hear the rest, or maybe he didn't let himself. Behind him, Maria spoke, voice hoarse, words stitched together by exhaustion. She slipped near the deep end. I couldn't. There wasn't time to call anyone. I had to." "Don't talk," Gray Lawrence snapped, turning on her like a storm. "You were supposed to be watching her. How could you let her get that close?" Maria didn't flinch. Her uniform clung to her skin, heavy and dripping, the fabric cold against her ribs. 29 years old, barely 4 months into this job, and already standing in front of the most powerful man in Napa Valley with the taste of chlorine still burning her throat. She looked at him with tired eyes, and for a heartbeat she almost spoke. But then she only said, "I didn't let her. She leaned too far. I saw her go under. I jumped." "You can't even swim," he shot back, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Not well," she said quietly, "but well enough." Isabel tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy, don't yell. She saved me." Gray Lawrence gathered the child in his arms, his jaw tight inside. "Sweetheart, go get warm, but now." The girl hesitated, her eyes flicking to Maria Kyo, and then padded into the house, water squishing under her small feet. And then it was only the two of them, Gray Lawrence and Maria, man and maid, divided by a silence that felt heavier than any words. "You should have yelled," he said coldly. "You don't just throw yourself in like a fool. What if you'd both drowned?" Maria's breath came shallow, but her voice didn't break. "Sir, if I hadn't jumped, she wouldn't be here." He didn't answer. He only brushed past her, muttering, "Change into something dry. Stay out of sight until further notice." And just like that, she was dismissed, standing alone by the pool with the sun bleeding into the horizon. Water dripped from her hair onto the stone tiles. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the cold and something deeper. No one asked if she was all right. No one saw her chest still aching from the water she'd swallowed, no one but the wind. That night, the house was quiet in the way big houses get, like every shadow is watching. Isabel slept bundled in her bed, a space heater humming softly. Gray Lawrence sat in his study with a glass of scotch. But his mind wasn't on the glowing stock tickers flashing across his screen. No, he kept seeing her, Maria, wet and shaking, dragging his little girl from the water like it was nothing. And still, instead of gratitude, something inside him twisted into anger. She was reckless, he told himself. Reckless, foolish. And yet, damn it, he muttered, downing the drink in one swallow. Across the estate, Maria sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the staff quarters, her hands wrapped around an old photograph of her mother, a woman with kind eyes and a smile that looked like sunlight. Maria whispered into the dark, her voice raw and low. "You always said doing the right thing didn't feel good. Guess you were right." Outside, the pool lay still under the moonlight. No one saw the maid who couldn't swim throw herself into the deep. No one saw her cough or shake or fight her way back to the surface. But if you'd been there, you'd have seen it. You'd have seen her rise from the bottom, not because she wanted to be a hero, but because she couldn't bear the thought of that little girl sinking into silence. And that was the kind of thing no man, not even Gray Lawrence Langston, could ignore forever. The following morning, the Langston estate felt different. The air was still thick with the humidity of the summer's last breath. But there was a tension now, the kind that lingers long after a storm. Gray Lawrence walked through the house like a man who had lost his way, his footsteps echoing through the grand hallways that had once felt like home. Now they felt like a maze, each corner shadowed by something he couldn't quite grasp. Iris was still asleep, wrapped in her blankets, untouched by the drama that had unfolded the night before. She hadn't seen him when he left for work this morning, and she wouldn't understand why he couldn't stay. But he couldn't stay. He had his own demons to face, and they didn't include her for now. He couldn't let her see the cracks in his carefully constructed life. The cracks that had started to show when Maria jumped into that pool, saving his daughter without a second thought. Gray Lawrence took the stairs to his study slowly, his feet dragging the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had work to do, the estate, the business, Iris. He couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. But he felt it creeping up on him, this feeling that everything he had built was slipping through his fingers, no matter how tightly he held on. When he opened the door to his study, he was met with the soft, welcoming hum of his computer. But it felt wrong, the same numbers, the same figures, but none of it mattered anymore. Neither of it made sense. He sat at the desk, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, but the words he wanted to type, the things he needed to do, wouldn't come. His thoughts kept drifting back to Maria. She had been here for 4 months now, just a temporary job to get through her debts, she said. But it was never just a temporary job, not to her, and not to him. There was something about her. Something that unsettled him, something that made him question the things he had believed to be true about the world. She was more than just a maid, more than just a woman who took care of the house. She was a force, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. A knock at the door brought him back to reality. "Mr. Langston?" It was Jacob, the head groundskeeper. "The news vans are starting to gather outside. They're asking about yesterday." Gray Lawrence's jaw tightened. He hadn't been prepared for this. The world beyond the estate was closing in, and he had no control over it. The leaks, the stories, it was all spinning out of control. "Tell them there's nothing to comment on. Keep them away from the gates," he said, his voice colder than he meant it to be. "And make sure the staff stays out of sight. I don't want anyone talking to them." Jacob nodded, his face betraying a mixture of confusion and concern. "Yes, sir." As the door closed behind him, Gray Lawrence's mind began to race again. This wasn't just about Maria anymore. It wasn't just about Iris, either. This was bigger. This was the kind of thing that would bring everything crashing down. The kind of thing that could destroy his reputation, his legacy, the future he had built for himself and his daughter. He stood up, his body stiff, and walked over to the window. Outside, the staff was moving, the daily rhythm of the estate continuing as it always did. But he felt disconnected from it all, like he was watching someone else's life unfold. Gray Lawrence wasn't prepared for what came next. Maria walked in. Her presence was quiet, like the calm before a storm. She was dressed in plain clothes today. No uniform, just a simple gray shirt and black pants. She wasn't the maid anymore, not in his eyes. She was something else now, something he didn't fully understand. He didn't speak right away, unsure of what to say. She stood there in the doorway, her eyes calm, steady, but there was something in them that told him she knew what was happening. She knew everything. "I made breakfast," she said softly, breaking the silence. For Iris, Gray Lawrence didn't respond immediately. He couldn't, the words were stuck in his throat. He wanted to shout at her. He wanted to ask her why she had to do what she did, why she had to risk her life for his daughter. But instead, he just stood there, staring at her, unsure of what to say. "I don't need you to make breakfast," he finally said, his voice tight, too tight. "I didn't ask you to—" "I know," she interrupted, her voice gentle, "but I wanted to." She was scared, Mr. Langston. "I wanted to make sure she had something familiar." Gray Lawrence swallowed hard, the words caught between anger and something else, something he wasn't ready to face. He had been angry last night, furious, even. But now, standing in front of her, he wasn't sure if it was her he was angry at, or himself. "Iris is fine," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "She's safe. And that's all that matters." Maria didn't answer right away. She stepped into the room, her eyes never leaving his. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step carried weight. "You didn't have to do it alone," she said, her voice soft. "But you did." "You can't protect her from everything, Mr. Langston." Gray Lawrence felt something shift in him. It was like a pressure building inside his chest, something he had ignored for too long. Terry. He wasn't used to people speaking to him this way. Used to people who feared him, respected him, stayed in line. But Maria wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't intimidated by him, and for the first time in a long while, that made him uneasy. "I didn't want her to get hurt," he said, his voice strained. "I didn't want you to—" "I know," Maria cut in again. "But sometimes, Mr. Langston, you can't control everything. You can't protect her from everything." Gray Lawrence's eyes softened, but he didn't let the emotion show. He couldn't, not yet. He turned away from her, moving to his desk. He didn't want to talk about this anymore. He didn't want to feel this. He wanted to go back to the way things were, back to the way he could control everything. But he knew he couldn't. "I'll take care of the press," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll handle everything. You just keep doing your job." Maria didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded and turned to leave. And for the first time in a long time, Gray Lawrence felt the weight of his own failure settle on his shoulders. The morning dragged on, the air thick and stifling as though the house itself was holding its breath. Gray Lawrence had always prided himself on control, on the ability to shape his world to his liking. But today, everything felt like it was slipping away, like the universe itself was conspiring to tear down the walls he had so carefully built. He sat at his desk, staring at the blank screen in front of him, his fingers tapping the edge of his keyboard without purpose. The silence in the study was overwhelming, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. He glanced up, his eyes moving across the room, but everything seemed distant, unreal. His gaze stopped on the photo of Iris, the one he had taken on her birthday just a year ago. The little girl in that picture was pure joy, her smile so wide it seemed to stretch from one side of the frame to the other. That girl was still here, in this house, but there was a shadow over her now. A shadow Gray Lawrence couldn't shake. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He needed to do something. Anything. He couldn't just sit here while everything around him unraveled. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, slipping it on with a force that betrayed his unease. As he headed for the door, he heard a soft knock. He paused, the tension tightening in his chest again. "Come in." Maria stepped into the room, her presence as quiet as ever. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her eyes were calm, but there was something else in them now. Something deeper. She was waiting for him to speak, but he didn't know what to say. The last thing he wanted was to discuss the events of last night, but he knew it couldn't be avoided. "I'm heading out," he said, his voice curt, though he tried to keep it even. "There's a meeting I can't cancel." Maria nodded. "I'll make sure Iris stays on schedule." "She's been asking about you." Gray Lawrence clenched his jaw but said nothing. Iris was always asking about him, always wanting to know why he wasn't there, why he didn't play with her, why he was so often distant. He had gotten good at answering with excuses, but even he could hear the hollow sound of those words. Now, they no longer had weight. They no longer made sense. "Don't forget to rest," Maria added quietly, her voice softer now, almost like a mother's. "You've been working too hard." Gray Lawrence turned away, not wanting to see the pity in her eyes, not wanting to hear the quiet judgment that lurked behind her words. "I'm fine," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I'll be back later." He walked past her, not looking at her, not wanting to acknowledge the tension between them. The air around him seemed heavier now, filled with something unsaid. As he moved through the hallway, he heard the soft sound of Iris's voice in the next room. She was talking to Maria, asking questions, asking about things that made Maid Gray Lawrence uncomfortable. Questions he didn't have the answers to. He reached the front door, pulling it open with more force than necessary. The cool air hit his face, sharp and refreshing. For a moment, he thought maybe he could leave it all behind. Maybe he could just drive away. Find a place where he could think without the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. But he didn't. He walked to his car, climbed in, and started the engine, the familiar hum of the motor filling the space. As he pulled out of the driveway, he glanced back at the house, at the windows he knew so well, at the life he had built within these walls. He didn't know what was waiting for him when he returned. But he knew this wasn't frime and warned this. It wasn't going to be easy. He arrived at the office, the world of business and finance waiting for him. The sterile, controlled environment he was used to, but even here it didn't feel right. The numbers on his desk, the calls from investors, the endless meetings, they were all distractions now. Nothing mattered anymore, not really. He felt the pull of the estate, the weight of what was happening there. But he had to do this. He had to keep it together, at least outwardly. The morning passed in a blur, the hours stretching on like minutes. His mind kept drifting back to Maria and Iris, to the pool, to the chaos that had ensued. He didn't want to think about it. He didn't want to deal with it. But it was there, gnawing at him, making it impossible to focus. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The others in the office glanced up, but no one said anything. Gray Lawrence was well known for his solitary nature, for his ability to work through anything. But today he wasn't interested in work. He needed to go back. He needed to face whatever was waiting for him. When he returned to the estate, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. The house looked quiet, peaceful even, but Gray Lawrence knew better. Inside, the storm was still raging. He stepped through the front door, his eyes immediately searching for Maria, for Iris. He found them in the kitchen. Iris was sitting at the table, drawing her crayons scattered across the surface. Maria was beside her, her back to Gray Lawrence as she prepared a tray of food. Gray Lawrence stood in the doorway watching them. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to apologize, how to make things right. He had failed them both. But the words wouldn't come, not yet. Maria turned as she heard him, her eyes meeting his for the first time since the pool. There was no anger in them now, no judgment, just acceptance. She nodded slightly, and Gray Lawrence knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same again. Iris looked up at him, her face lighting up with that same innocent joy that always seemed to melt his heart. "Daddy, you're home," she said, rushing over to him, her small arms wrapping around his legs. Gray Lawrence knelt down, his hand resting on her shoulder. "I'm home, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here." And for a moment, just a moment, everything felt like it used to. Everything felt normal. But deep down, Gray Lawrence knew that things would never go back to how they were. The world had changed. And so had he. The days stretched out like a blanket too warm for comfort, suffocating in its stillness. Gray Lawrence found himself moving through the motions, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. At first he threw himself into his work, burying himself in numbers, in meetings, in the never-ending grind of the corporate world. But it wasn't the same. He wasn't the same. The life he had once held so tightly to, the fortress he had built with every dollar, every deal, every decision, now seemed fragile, like something he could no longer control. Maria, though, she was different. Every morning she was there, always there, just outside his sight, just outside his grasp, but present in everything. Her presence was no longer something that simply filled the house. It had become part of it, as natural as the walls and the windows. When she spoke to Iris, her words were calm, soothing, like a balm for wounds no one had acknowledged. And Iris, ever the child, clung to her as though she were the only constant thing in her world. And Gray Lawrence hated it, not because of Maria, but because he could see the truth now. He could see how much his daughter needed her. He could see how much she depended on the very woman he had once dismissed as the help. His own insecurities twisted inside him, biting at his heels every time he saw them together. He hated how Maria had become a mother to Iris in ways he couldn't be. He hated how easily Iris had attached herself to her. And he hated that Maria never once asked for any of this. She had simply become everything Iris needed. And Gray Lawrence felt like he was fading into the background. It was early one morning when Gray Lawrence's thoughts finally broke free from their prison. He woke to the soft hum of the house, the coffee brewing, the sound of Maria's quiet footsteps as she went about the day's duties. Iris was still asleep, a rare occurrence for the young girl who had always risen with the sun. Gray Lawrence sat up in bed, the cold light from the window creeping in around the edges of the blinds. He wasn't sure what had driven him out of bed so early, but he knew one thing. He had to face this. He stepped into the hallway, the quiet of the house stretching out before him. His footsteps were soft on the hardwood floors, but the sound of his movement filled the space like thunder. He paused at the kitchen door. Maria was at the stove, stirring something in a pot, her back to him. The smell of something warm and comforting filled the air, but it didn't bring him the peace it once had. When Maria turned and saw him, she didn't say anything at first. She simply nodded, as though she had been expecting him. "Morning," she said quietly. Gray Lawrence leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. He hadn't planned this moment, but it was happening anyway. "Maria," he started, his voice more unsure than he wanted to admit, "I need to apologize." Maria paused, the spoon in her hand hanging mid-air. She turned slowly to face him, her eyes steady but not unkind. "You don't owe me an apology, Mr. Langston." "I do," he said, his voice harder now. "I've treated you like you're just a part of the furniture, like you don't matter. But the truth is, you've done more for this family than I have in the last few months. I see it now, I see what you've been doing, and I'm sorry." Maria didn't reply right away. She just stood there, her hands resting on the edge of the counter. She wasn't angry, she wasn't upset. She was simply waiting. "I never asked for any of this," he continued, his voice quieter now, the weight of his words sinking in. "I didn't ask for you to step into my world. I didn't ask for you to take care of everything. But you did it because it was the right thing to do, and I didn't see it." Maria finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "It's not about being seen, Mr. Langston. It's about doing what's right." Gray Lawrence's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected her to say that. It wasn't what he thought he would hear. He expected her to argue with him, to remind him of the things he had done, the things he hadn't done. But she didn't. She was telling him the truth, and it stung. "I didn't see you," he said, the words coming out as if they were meant for him more than for her. "I didn't see you at all." Maria looked down, her fingers tightening around the spoon she held. She nodded, but there was something behind her eyes, something he couldn't place. "Rare of this is about me, Mr. Langston," she said softly. "It's about Iris. It's about keeping her safe, keeping her happy." Gray Lawrence's chest tightened. He wanted to respond, to say something, but the words didn't come. What could he say? That he had failed as a father? That he had failed her? "Iris loves you," he finally said, his voice breaking the silence between them. "I never thought I'd see her so attached to someone who wasn't family." Maria's expression softened, but she didn't smile. She just nodded again, a gesture of understanding. "She deserves more than what I can give her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She deserves more than what I've been able to offer her. She deserves better." Maria turned back to the stove, but there was a quiet shift in the air, like something had broken open. Something heavy, something that had been buried for too long. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, without looking back at him, "We all do." Gray Lawrence stood there, his mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. His hands trembled slightly, his fingers itching for something to hold on to, but there was nothing to grasp. The weight of the past few months, the pressure of everything that had happened, was suddenly too much. He had never been good at facing the truth, not in his business, not in his life. But here it was, and he didn't know how to face it. The silence that filled the kitchen was heavier than it had ever been, thick with unspoken words and emotions too raw to confront. Gray Lawrence stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. His eyes fell to the floor, his thoughts swirling like a storm in his mind. The house seemed so still, but inside everything was shaking. For the first time in a long while, Gray Lawrence Langston was unsure of his own place in the world. The certainty that had always guided him, the sharpness of his decisions, had dulled. His mind kept racing back to that moment by the pool, the moment he had seen Iris's small body trembling, the moment he had seen Maria risk her own life to save her. And in that moment, he knew that everything he thought he had built, everything he had worked for, wasn't as solid as it seemed. Maria, standing at the stove, her back to him, was the only one who seemed unaffected by the storm swirling inside him. She was the calm in the eye of his personal hurricane. Her presence was simple, steady, like the quiet rhythm of the house. She moved with purpose, her focus on the task at hand. But there was an edge to her, too, something Gray Lawrence hadn't fully understood before, something that made her different from anyone else he had ever known. Finally he spoke again, his voice softer now, as though the weight of everything had settled on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. Maria didn't turn around, but her shoulders stiffened slightly. She didn't need to look at him to know what he was saying. "There's nothing to fix," she replied quietly, her voice steady. "Sometimes things just are what they are." Gray Lawrence stared at the back of her head, trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the world he had constructed for himself. She had come into his life with no expectations, no grand designs. But somehow, without ever asking for it, she had become the one thing that held everything together. And he didn't know how to handle it. He didn't know how to handle her. "I don't want to keep failing her," he murmured, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I don't want to keep failing you." Maria paused in her task, the spoon still in her hand. She didn't say anything for a long while, and for a moment, Gray Lawrence wondered if she would speak at all. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was unreadable, her eyes steady. "You haven't failed anyone," she said, her tone firm, "but you can't keep trying to control everything. You can't protect Iris from everything, Gray Lawrence. No one can." His chest tightened at the mention of Iris's name. The weight of his daughter's world, the pressure of being the one responsible for her safety, had always been something Gray Lawrence carried on his shoulders. He had never questioned it. He had never allowed himself to think that there might be another way to be there for her. But now, standing in front of Maria, he felt it, the realization that he had been so focused on controlling everything that he had lost sight of what mattered most. "You're right," he said, his voice low. "I've been so focused on keeping her safe that I've forgotten how to really be there for her." "And for you," Maria didn't speak right away. She stepped closer to him, her eyes softening slightly, but there was still a distance between them, a space that couldn't be bridged with words. "I know what you're trying to do," she said quietly, "but sometimes you have to trust that other people can help. You don't have to carry it all on your own." Gray Lawrence nodded, his throat tight. The truth of her words hit him harder than he expected. "I don't know how to let go of that." "How to trust," she smiled faintly, a sad, knowing smile that made his heart ache. "You don't have to trust everything, just the ones who've shown they won't let you down." He met her gaze then, his eyes searching hers for something, anything, that would make sense of the emotions flooding through him. There was no judgment there, no anger, no resentment, just an understanding that he hadn't expected. He hadn't expected her to be the one who would make him see the truth, to make him realize that all of his strength, all of his control hadn't been enough. And maybe it wasn't supposed to be. Maybe it wasn't about control at all. He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest, and for the first time in what felt like years, he felt something like relief. It wasn't all fixed, it wasn't all right, but there was a chance now, a chance for something real. "I'm not asking you to fix me," he said quietly. "I just need to know how to move forward." Maria's expression softened, her gaze steady. She didn't speak for a long time, but when she did, her voice was gentle. "The only way forward is by letting go of the past, of the things you can't control." Gray Lawrence felt a lump form in his throat, his chest tight with the weight of everything unsaid. I don't know if I'm ready to do that. You don't have to be ready, she said softly. You just have to try. The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Gray Lawrence felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about knowing exactly what to do. It was about taking that first step, no matter how difficult it was, and trusting that the rest would follow. I'm trying, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Maria nodded, her eyes never leaving his. That's all you can do. And for the first time, Gray Lawrence felt like he wasn't standing alone. Not anymore. The moment stretched out, the world outside the kitchen window glowing in the soft light of the morning. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he could ever fix everything that had been broken. But in that quiet moment, standing in front of Maria, he realized something important. He didn't have to. He just had to be there. And for the first time in a long time, Gray Lawrence Langston understood what it meant to truly be present. The days passed slowly after that, each one slipping by like the last. The estate, once a bustling monument of wealth and success, had become quieter, more introspective. Gray Lawrence had stopped rushing, stopped pushing himself and everyone around him as hard. He still carried the weight of his responsibilities, but there was a subtle shift now. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about control. It was about being present, about letting the house, his life, become something more than just a place he ruled from behind a desk. And Maria, in her quiet way, had become part of that. She moved through the house like she had always belonged there, but her presence now held a certain grace that wasn't just about duty. It was about connection. She wasn't a maid anymore, and they both knew it. She had become the steady thread that had woven itself through the fabric of their family, whether Gray Lawrence had wanted it or not. Iris, of course, still saw Maria as the woman who had saved her life. But she also saw her as someone who listened, someone who made her feel safe when the world outside the gates seemed too big, overwhelming. Gray Lawrence couldn't help but notice it, how Iris's world had expanded in the presence of Maria. She wasn't just his daughter anymore. She was a child who had begun to see the world for what it truly was. Beautiful, yes, but also dangerous, unpredictable, and full of pain. And Maria, who had once been so distant, had given her the gift of seeing both sides. It was the quiet moments that made Gray Lawrence feel the most unsettled. The dinners where Maria joined them at the table, where she and Iris would talk about their day, things that Gray Lawrence never thought he would witness. The way Maria looked at Iris, the way she spoke to her like a mother might, with both tenderness and authority. He could see it now, the way Maria had stepped into a role that Gray Lawrence never thought anyone could fill. But it wasn't just about the role she played for Iris, it was about how she had changed him. It was about how he had stopped looking at her as someone who just took care of things and started seeing her as someone who had become, in her own quiet way, an equal. One afternoon, as the sun began to sink behind the hills, Gray Lawrence found himself walking through the gardens alone. It was his escape now, this quiet space that had once felt like a luxury, but had grown to be a place of reflection. The roses were in full bloom again, their fragrance sweet in the warm air. The estate had always been beautiful, but now it felt different, alive in a way it hadn't before. He hadn't seen Maria for the better part of the afternoon. Iris had gone off to play her laughter, carrying on the breeze. Gray Lawrence's thoughts were still tangled in the events of the past weeks, but there was something in the air, like the beginning of change. He walked deeper into the garden, past the roses, toward the vine-covered trellis where he and Margaret had once spent hours talking about their dreams. He hadn't been back here since her death, but today felt different. Today he could almost feel her presence in the air, as if the space was holding on to her memory. It was then that he saw Maria, standing by the fountain, her head tilted slightly as she watched the water flow. She was so still, her figure framed by the soft golden light of the evening. He couldn't help but watch her for a moment, taking in the way the sun made her skin glow, the way her posture was calm yet purposeful. She looked so at peace, like she was a part of the world around her, something he hadn't truly understood until now. He stepped closer, unsure of what to say. His mouth was dry, his chest tight with emotions. He didn't know how to process. When Maria turned to look at him, her expression was soft, almost knowing, as if she had felt him there before he even spoke. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, his voice rough with unspoken words. Maria smiled faintly, her eyes soft but steady. "It's peaceful here," she replied, her voice quiet, almost reverent. "I can hear everything better in the stillness." Gray Lawrence nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than he intended. There was something about her, something that pulled at him, made him feel like he was finally seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to open up again, to trust anyone." Maria didn't say anything right away. She just stood there, looking at him, her eyes filled with understanding. She didn't need to ask for the details. She didn't need to know everything that had brought him to this moment. She simply knew. "You're doing it now," she said softly, her voice like a balm for the rawness in his chest. "And that's what matters." Gray Lawrence swallowed hard, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't deny what she said. He had spent so much of his life keeping people at a distance, keeping his emotions locked away behind walls he thought he had control over. But now, with Maria standing in front of him, he realized that the walls had started to crumble. "I don't know what's going to happen next," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know it doesn't feel as heavy as it did before." Maria smiled then, a small but genuine smile. "That's the first step, Gray Lawrence, letting go of the weight." He nodded, feeling something shift inside him. It wasn't all fixed, and it wouldn't ever be. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally starting to move forward. "Maria," he began, his voice softer now, I don't know how to thank you for everything. You've done more for me, for us, than I could ever repay." She shook her head, the smile fading slightly. "You don't owe me anything, Gray Lawrence. You've already done it. You've already begun to change." And that was the truth. He had started to change in ways he never thought possible. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick, but he was ready to try. The silence stretched out between them, comfortable now like a shared understanding. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows over the garden, but neither of them moved. They stood together, two people who had come through something difficult, something painful, but had emerged on the other side, not unbroken, but stronger. And for the first time, Gray Lawrence Langston felt something he had never truly felt before. Peace. The days began to blend together, stretching into weeks, each one a quiet march toward something unknown but inevitable. Gray Lawrence spent more time at the estate now, less consumed by the constant hum of business, less driven by the need to be everywhere at once. The work was still there, still calling to him, but now it seemed distant, like an old tune playing on the radio from another room. He no longer felt the need to answer it immediately. There was something else in the world that mattered more now, something that hadn't existed in his life before. Maria, she had become a constant in his day, though she never made a show of it. She was everywhere, in the background, her presence soft but undeniable. It wasn't just in the meals she prepared for Iris, though she did that with a quiet grace, or in the way she guided the girl through her studies. It was in the way she moved through the house, never demanding attention but always commanding it. Maria's calm had begun to permeate the estate like the scent of the roses outside, subtle but pervasive. Gray Lawrence found himself spending more time with her, not in any planned way, but in those small moments that seemed to stretch into hours, conversations over dinner, shared glances as Iris pulled them into her little world of games and stories. They didn't talk about the past, not directly, not in so many words, but it hung between them like a shadow they were both learning to live with. It was late one evening when Gray Lawrence found himself standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching Maria. She was sitting at the counter, sipping a cup of tea, the dim light from the hanging pendant above casting soft shadows across her face. The house was quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant rustle of wind against the windows. He hadn't meant to interrupt her, but the silence between them was too thick to ignore. "How did we get here?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. He didn't know what had driven him to ask the question, but once it was out there, he couldn't take it back. Maria didn't look up right away. She took another sip of her tea, letting the silence hang for a moment longer before answering. "One step at a time, I guess." He walked into the room, his gaze fixed on her. There was no judgment in her eyes, no expectation, just a calm understanding that made him feel seen. "I didn't think I was capable of this," he said, his words surprising even him. He had been so used to thinking of himself as a man in control, a man who made decisions and expected them to be carried out. But now, standing here in this kitchen, surrounded by the life that had grown around him without him fully realizing it, he felt small. He felt human. "You don't have to be," Maria said gently, her eyes meeting his now. "Nobody's perfect, Gray Lawrence, and no one is supposed to have it all figured out." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, the weight of his own expectations easing just a little. "I've been so focused on doing everything right, on keeping everyone safe, that I forgot what it meant to actually be, to actually live." Maria nodded, her expression softening. "It's easy to get lost in that. I've been there, too, through thinking that if you just keep doing the right things, everything will turn out okay. But sometimes the right thing is to let go, to trust." Her words struck him with the force of a revelation, though he couldn't quite explain why trust. It had never been easy for him, not with anyone. He had built his empire on control, on the belief that if you held the reins tightly enough, nothing could go wrong. But now, as he stood in this quiet kitchen, watching Maria's face as she spoke, he realized that control had never been the answer. He stepped closer to the counter, the air between them thick with unspoken understanding. "I don't know how to trust," he admitted, his voice rough. "Not anymore, not after everything." Maria looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she set down her tea. She didn't speak at first, but her gaze softened. "You've been hurt. And I don't know what that feels like, but I know it takes time. Trust isn't something you can rush. It's something you have to build, step by step." Gray Lawrence nodded, though the thought of building trust again seemed like an insurmountable task. "I want to be different," he said, almost to himself. "I want to be a better father, a better person." "You already are," Maria said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're trying." That's all anyone can ask for. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet stretched out between them, comfortable now, not like the strained silence of earlier days, but like the kind of silence that happens between two people who understand each other without needing to explain every thought, and for the first time, Gray Lawrence felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he had thought. Later that evening, after Iris had gone to bed and the house had settled into its usual rhythm, Gray Lawrence found himself standing at the window, gazing out over the vineyard. The land stretched out before him, bathed in the soft glow of the moon. It was beautiful, peaceful even. And for the first time in a long time, Gray Lawrence allowed himself to just be. There was no pressing business, no phone calls, no investors to please. For once, he was simply here, in this place, with these people. Maria's words lingered in his mind, a quiet reminder that he didn't have to do it all alone. He didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to keep moving forward. And as he stood there, looking out over the land that had been the foundation of his success, he realized something important. He had spent so much of his life chasing after things, money, power, control, but the things that truly mattered were the things he couldn't control. The love of his daughter, the quiet strength of Maria, the moments of peace that came when he allowed himself to just exist, without the constant pressure to be more than what he was. For the first time in a long time, Gray Lawrence Langston felt a sense of calm settle in his chest. And he didn't have to chase it anymore. The days that followed were quieter still, but there was a subtle shift in the air. It wasn't that the storm had passed, not by any means. Gray Lawrence knew there were still battles to fight, both in the world outside the gates of his estate and within the walls of his own home. But it was as if, for the first time in a long time, he had begun to find peace in the midst of it. A peace that didn't come from control or dominance, but from something simpler, something more genuine. Gray Lawrence found himself looking forward to the small moments with Iris, those moments that had always been there, but had gone unnoticed in the rush of life. He'd sit with her after dinner, reading the same stories over and over again, each time a little more aware of the joy in her eyes as she traced the pictures with her fingers. Sometimes they'd just sit in silence, the two of them in the garden, Iris drawing on a pad of paper while Gray Lawrence watched the world go by. Maria, too, had become an essential part of their days. She was there in the mornings, making breakfast for Iris with the same care she had always shown. She was there when Iris needed help with her homework, when the little girl came to her with questions about things that were far beyond her years. Gray Lawrence watched it all, watched the way Maria and Iris had forged a bond that was deeper than anything he could have imagined, and it wasn't just in the way they interacted. It was in the quiet understanding that passed between them, the unspoken promise that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. But the tension between Gray Lawrence and Maria still lingered, subtle but undeniable. They didn't talk about it directly. They didn't need to, but every time their eyes met, there was something there, a spark of something more. It was as if they were both waiting, unsure of what the next step would be, unsure of how to move forward in a world that had become so complicated, so messy. Gray Lawrence was no fool. He knew what was happening between them. He knew that there was a connection, a bond, that had grown between them. But he also knew that it wasn't something that could be rushed. It wasn't something that could be forced. It was something that had to develop in its own time, its own way. And for now he was content to let it be. But Maria, as always, was a mystery to him. She had been a stranger when she first came to the estate, a woman who had seemed so distant, so separate from his world. But now she was something else entirely. She had become part of their family, part of his life, and he couldn't help but wonder, could she ever be more than that? It was one evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the first stars began to appear, that Gray Lawrence found himself standing outside, watching Iris chase fireflies in the garden. She was laughing, her small form darting from one side of the yard to the other, her joy contagious. Maria stood beside him, her arms crossed loosely, her gaze following Iris's every move. "She's happy," Gray Lawrence said softly, his voice almost as if to himself. Maria nodded, her eyes soft. "She's a good kid, she deserves everything," Gray Lawrence said, the words heavy with meaning. He didn't realize how much he meant them until he said them aloud. Iris had always been his priority, always been the reason he did everything he did. But now, watching her so carefree, so full of life, he realized just how much he had taken for granted. "I know," Maria said quietly. "She deserves a lot more than just a father who provides for her." Gray Lawrence turned to look at her, startled by the honesty in her words. For the first time, he saw her not as the woman who had come to serve him and his family, but as an equal, as someone who understood the complexities of love and responsibility in a way he never had. "Maybe I've been too focused on what I can give her," he said, his voice low. "Maybe I haven't been focused enough on what I can be for her." Maria didn't respond right away. She just watched Iris for a moment longer before turning back to him. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. "You can be whatever she needs you to be," Maria said softly. "But you have to let go of the idea that you can control everything. You can't fix everything, Gray Lawrence, not for her, not for anyone." He let out a breath, feeling the weight of her words sink in. It wasn't something he had wanted to hear, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. He had spent so long thinking that control, that power, was the answer to everything. But now, with Maria standing beside him, he knew that control was just a mask that had hidden the truth from him for far too long. "I don't know how to stop," he admitted. "I don't know how to let go." Maria's eyes softened, her expression almost tender. "You don't have to know right away. Just start by being here, by being present. That's enough for now." Gray Lawrence nodded, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't quite name. But for the first time he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could be the father Iris needed. Hope that he could learn to trust again, not just in Maria, but in himself. And for the first time in a long time, Gray Lawrence Langston felt like he might be able to breathe. Later that evening, after dinner had been cleared and the house settled into a quiet rhythm, Gray Lawrence found himself standing by the window in the study, looking out over the vineyard. The night air was cool, the stars above shining brightly. It was peaceful here. Peaceful in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Behind him, the door opened quietly. He didn't turn around at first, but he knew who it was, Maria. "I thought you'd be in bed," she said, her voice soft. Gray Lawrence turned then, looking at her as she stepped into the room. She was standing just inside the door, her expression unreadable but steady. "I can't sleep," he said quietly. "I've been thinking." Maria didn't ask what he was thinking about. She didn't need to. She could see it in the way his shoulders were hunched, in the way he held himself, as if the weight of the world was still pressing down on him. "I'm not sure I know how to do this," he admitted, his voice rough. "I don't know how to be the person Iris needs me to be." Maria didn't respond at first. She just walked over to the window, standing beside him, her gaze fixed on the stars outside. "You're trying," she said simply. "That's all you need to do." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Gray Lawrence realized that trying was enough. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about showing up, being present, and doing the best he could, even when it felt like he didn't have all the answers. "I'm trying," he repeated, as if the words were a promise to himself. And in that moment, standing there beside Maria, with the world outside so quiet, Gray Lawrence Langston understood what it meant to truly be there. To be present, to be human, to be flawed, and still worthy of love. As the days passed, the quiet rhythm of the estate became both a comfort and a challenge. Gray Lawrence had stopped fighting against the slow march of time, no longer rushing through his days with the frenetic energy that had once been his trademark. Now each moment seemed to stretch a little longer, each conversation a little deeper. The silence between him and Maria was no longer filled with tension or unsaid words. It was a companion, a space where something unspoken was slowly being built. It was strange, this feeling of being in limbo, of not knowing exactly where he stood. Gray Lawrence had always been certain of his place in the world. He had carved his empire with his own two hands, wielding control like a sword. But now, standing on the precipice of something new, he couldn't quite see where he was going. He only knew that he was no longer the same man who had walked through these halls a year ago. A man who had thought he could solve everything with power and money. Maria had a way of making him see things differently. They spoke less now. There was no need for constant conversation. But when they did speak, their words had a weight to them. They were no longer just about the tasks at hand or the trivialities of daily life. There was an undercurrent of something deeper, a shared understanding that neither of them had been willing to face until now. One evening, after dinner, Iris had wandered off to her room, leaving the house quiet. Maria was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her gaze distant but steady. Gray Lawrence stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment before walking over to sit across from her. The house was still, the quiet only interrupted by the occasional creak of wood or the soft hum of the fridge. "You're not running away, are you?" he asked suddenly, his voice almost a whisper, though the question was anything but light. Maria's eyes flickered up to meet his, her brow furrowing just slightly. There was a hesitation there, a fleeting moment where it seemed like she was considering the question more seriously than it deserved. "No," she replied softly, her voice even but with a touch of something unspoken. "I'm not going anywhere, Gray Lawrence." He nodded, though something in his chest tightened at her response. He wasn't sure why the question had slipped out of his mouth, why it had seemed so important in that moment. Maybe it was the fear of losing something he didn't fully understand. He had spent so much of his life controlling everything, making sure nothing was ever out of his grasp. But with Maria it felt different. She had become something so integral to their lives, to Iris's life, that the thought of losing her felt like a blow to the chest. "Good," he said, his voice rough. He looked down at the table, suddenly uncomfortable with the rawness of his words. "I don't think I could handle that right now." Maria didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, her gaze steady and knowing. It was as if she could see right through him, could see the fear that he was trying so hard to hide. And for a moment, Gray Lawrence was tempted to pull back, to close himself off again, but something in him resisted. For once, he didn't want to hide from the truth. "I'm not going anywhere," she repeated, her voice soft, reassuring. "But it's not just about staying, Gray Lawrence. It's about understanding what comes next." He met her gaze then, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. It wasn't just about staying. It was about moving forward, about building something from the wreckage of what had come before. And that, more than anything, was what terrified him. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But I know I can't do this without you." Maria's expression softened, though she didn't look away. Her eyes were calm, but there was something in them that made Gray Lawrence feel like he was being seen for the first time. Not the billionaire, not the man with all the answers, but the broken man trying to piece himself back together. "You're not alone," she said simply, as though the words were both an answer and a promise. Gray Lawrence swallowed hard, feeling something shift in his chest. For the first time, he let go of the weight he had been carrying. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to feel the burden lift, even if just a little. "I've spent so much time trying to fix things," he said, his voice catching, "trying to control everything. But I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if it can be fixed." Maria set her cup down on the table and leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "It's not about fixing, Gray Lawrence. It's about letting go. Letting things be what they are." Her words settled into him, like water soaking into dry earth. For so long he had believed that to be strong meant to control, to have everything in order. But now, with Maria sitting across from him, he realized that true strength came from vulnerability. It came from the courage to let go of the things that no longer served him, to accept the uncertainty of the future without trying to force it into a mold he could control. "I don't know if I can," he whispered, the words tasting like something foreign on his tongue. Maria smiled then, just a little, as though she understood exactly what he was saying without needing an explanation. "You don't have to know everything right now. Just take it one step at a time." Gray Lawrence looked at her, and in that moment, he saw something in her eyes, something that felt like a promise, like a commitment to walk this uncertain road with him, even when it felt like there was no clear path ahead. "I don't know what the future holds," he said slowly, his voice steady now, "but I'm willing to find out." "With you, with Iris?" Maria nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "Then that's all we need." And for the first time, Gray Lawrence Langston allowed himself to believe it, that it didn't matter that he didn't have all the answers. It didn't matter that the future was uncertain, that there were still so many things left unresolved. What mattered was that he was willing to face it, willing to move forward, no matter how difficult the path. And in that moment, standing in the quiet of the kitchen, Gray Lawrence realized something else, that sometimes the greatest strength came not from the things we could control, but from the things we let go of. The days after that conversation passed in a strange quiet, the kind of quiet that settled deep into the bones of the house, heavy but not oppressive. For once, there were no grand decisions to make, no battles to fight. It was as if the world had slowed, allowing Gray Lawrence, Maria, and Iris to breathe, to find their footing before the next wave came crashing down. But even in the stillness, Gray Lawrence couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just around the corner. It was a feeling he had learned to live with over the years, the ever-present hum of tension beneath the surface. Maria had become more than just a part of their daily lives. She had become a steadying force. He didn't have to say much to her. She seemed to understand him in ways that no one else ever had. There were no more walls between them, no more pretense. Maria had seen the cracks in his armor, and for the first time she hadn't flinched. But as much as he tried to hold on to the peace, there was always a nagging feeling at the back of his mind. The events of the past months had left their mark on him, and he knew that sooner or later the world would come knocking again. There was always a price to pay for what he had built, and that price was never paid in full. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Gray Lawrence found himself walking the grounds of the estate again, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. The air was crisp, the vineyard stretching out before him in a patchwork of deep greens and purples. He wasn't sure why he was here, just that he needed the space, needed the stillness that the garden offered. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he walked, the familiar sounds of the estate somehow grounding him in the midst of his thoughts. He didn't know where his mind was taking him, but then he saw her. Maria was standing at the far end of the garden, looking out over the rows of vines. The light caught the soft waves of her hair, and for a moment she looked like someone who had belonged here all along. Someone who was more than just a part of the house, but a part of the land itself. Gray Lawrence paused, watching her from a distance, a strange ache forming in his chest. It wasn't just the sense of her presence, though that was enough. It was the way she had become so essential to everything, to him. He cleared his throat, the sound too loud in the quiet. Maria turned, her eyes meeting his before a small smile tugged at her lips. There was a peace in her gaze, something that reached deep inside him, something he hadn't known he needed until now. You fring first of forced enchanters, smeth and setter fodder, and freefer. You okay? She asked, her voice soft but steady. Gray Lawrence nodded, but he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. I was just thinking about how much things have changed, how much I've changed. Maria didn't speak right away. She just looked at him, her expression thoughtful. She had a way of giving him space, allowing him to say what needed to be said without pushing him to hurry. I don't know how to stop, he said quietly, the words coming out before he could stop them. I don't know how to stop trying to fix everything. She took a step toward him, her eyes never leaving his. Maybe you don't have to fix everything, Gray Lawrence. Maybe you just have to be here, with her, with us. Her words sank in slowly, like a stone falling into water, rippling outward. The world didn't need him to be perfect. It needed him to be present. He walked toward her then, his steps slow but steady. When he reached her, he didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, the two of them together in the fading light, the cool air brushing past them. It felt right. It felt like the beginning of something new, something he had never allowed himself to see before. I've spent so much time running, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion, running from my past. Running from my mistakes, running from the fear of losing control. You don't have to run anymore, Maria said, her voice low but certain. You're here now. Gray Lawrence looked at her then, his gaze lingering on her face. There was so much he wanted to say, so many things he hadn't been able to put into words. But for once the words didn't matter. She understood him in a way that no one else ever had. I don't deserve you, he whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Maria's smile softened, a knowing look in her eyes. You don't have to deserve it. You just have to accept it. And in that moment, Gray Lawrence realized something that he hadn't allowed himself to see before. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't the man he had always tried to be, the man who had everything under control. He was just a man who had made mistakes, a man who had hurt people, but he was also a man who had learned to listen, learned to feel. And for the first time, he was learning how to truly be there. I don't know what comes next, he said, his voice quieter now, but I'm ready to find out. Maria reached out then, her hand resting gently on his arm. Then let's find out together. Gray Lawrence nodded, his chest tight but lighter than it had been in a long time. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like he might be able to face it. And as they stood there, side by side, watching the sunset slowly fade behind the hills, Gray Lawrence Langston realized that the life he had built wasn't defined by wealth or power. It was defined by the people he loved, by the ones who had stayed when the world seemed to be falling apart. For the first time, he understood that love didn't require perfection. It required vulnerability. It required showing up, even when it was hard. And as the light faded from the sky, Gray Lawrence knew, deep in his bones, that no matter what came next, he wasn't going to face it alone. Thank you for following this story on Shoe Stories. If this story moved you, taught you something, or made you reflect on the meaning of silence, please like, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below the video. Your voice matters. Let it be heard, whether it's in silence or loud, and don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos displayed on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity and unexpected heroes. We'll see you in the next story.